I was standing in my garage, staring at an empty space where 4 cords of seasoned oak should have been, when I realized someone had stolen my entire winter's supply of firewood. The concrete floor showed nothing but sawdust and a few scattered wood chips, where I'd spent the better part of last spring and summer splitting and stacking. I'd invested over $3,000 in having the trees removed from my property after that storm in April, then countless hours processing it all. Now, in late February, with temperatures still dipping below freezing most nights in Boulder, Colorado, every last piece was gone. My name is Frank Fitzgerald, and I'd moved into the Meadowbrook Heights subdivision about 18 months ago. It was one of those newer developments on the edge of town, where all the houses looked vaguely similar and the HOA ruled with an iron fist. I'd known about the HOA before buying, of course, but the house was perfect for my needs. A single guy working remotely as a software engineer with a dog who needed a yard. The property backed up to some protected forest land, which is why I'd chosen it. Privacy, nature, and the option to have a wood-burning fireplace that actually got used. I pulled out my phone and started scrolling through my security camera footage. I'd installed cameras after moving in, mostly to keep an eye on package deliveries, but I'd positioned one to cover the garage entrance. It took about 15 minutes of reviewing footage before I found what I was looking for, and what I saw made my blood boil. Starting in mid-November, people had been coming by and taking my firewood. Not random thieves in the night, but my neighbors. I watched as Margaret Hartford, who lived 3 houses down, backed her SUV up to my garage and loaded several pieces into her trunk. 2 days later, the Simmons family from across the street did the same thing. Then the Petersons. Then people I didn't even recognize. They were all just helping themselves like it was some kind of community resource. But the worst part was watching Rebecca Emerson, the HOA president herself, make multiple trips over the past few months. She'd show up with her husband's truck, load it up with what must have been half a cord at a time, and drive off. I counted at least 6 separate trips she'd made. Rebecca Emerson was exactly what you'd picture when you thought of an HOA president on a power trip. 52 years old, blonde hair always perfectly styled, and an expression that suggested she was perpetually smelling something unpleasant. She drove a white Mercedes and wore expensive athleisure outfits, even though I'd never seen her exercise. She ruled the HOA board like a dictator, and from what I'd gathered at the few meetings I'd attended, she'd been president for nearly 8 years. I took a deep breath and headed back inside my house. My golden retriever, Cooper, looked up hopefully from his bed by the fireplace, probably wondering if I was finally going to start a fire. The house had been getting progressively colder over the past few weeks, because I'd been rationing my remaining firewood, not realizing why my supply was depleting so quickly. I just assumed I was burning through it faster than expected and had been making do with the central heating, which was significantly more expensive. First thing Monday morning, I called Rebecca. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice dripping with the fake sweetness she reserved for HOA business. "Frank, how can I help you?" "Rebecca, I need to talk to you about my firewood. It's all gone, and I've got security footage showing that you and several other residents have been taking it." There was a pause. "Oh, that? Yes, well, I meant to discuss this with you. The HOA board voted back in October that any resources stored in visible or semi-visible locations would be considered community property. Your garage door was often open, and we assumed you were participating in the community sharing initiative." I felt my jaw clench. "The what? I never received any notice about this, and nobody asked me if they could take my firewood." That was over $3,000 worth of wood that I personally processed. Well, Frank, if you'd attended the October meeting, you would have known about the initiative. We can't be expected to personally notify every resident about every decision. That's why we have monthly meetings and send out the newsletter. I was at the October meeting, Rebecca. There was nothing about a community sharing initiative, and I've read every newsletter. This was never mentioned. Another pause, longer this time. I'll have to review the minutes. But regardless, the wood has been used now. Several residents relied on it to heat their homes this winter. You wouldn't want them to freeze, would you? They could have bought their own firewood like I did, or asked permission. This is theft, Rebecca. Her tone turned icy. I'd be very careful about throwing around accusations like that, Frank. The HOA board takes defamation very seriously. We acted in good faith based on our community guidelines. If you have an issue with how the board operates, you're welcome to submit a formal complaint, which we'll review at next month's meeting. You'll be hearing from me, I said and hung up. I spent the rest of that Monday researching Colorado HOA law and documenting everything I could find. I made a spreadsheet tracking every instance of someone taking my firewood based on the security footage, with dates, times, and approximate amounts. For Rebecca alone, I calculated she'd taken roughly 2 cords, worth about $1,500. The other neighbors combined had taken the remaining 2 cords. On Tuesday, I drafted a formal invoice. I priced everything out based on current market rates for seasoned firewood in the Boulder area, which was running about $750 per cord for oak. I added my labor costs for splitting and stacking at $25 per hour, which was actually quite reasonable. Conservative estimates put my time investment at around 60 hours. I itemized everything professionally, attached screenshots from my security footage with timestamps, and calculated a total of $4,500. I sent the invoice via certified mail to Rebecca's home address and to the HOA's official mailing address. I also emailed copies to every board member I could identify, which included Rebecca, Todd Marshall, the treasurer, and Patricia Sullivan, the secretary. The response came faster than I expected. Wednesday evening, I found a notice taped to my front door. It was an official HOA violation for improper storage of materials in violation of community standards and failure to maintain aesthetic guidelines. I was being fined $500 and given 10 days to comply or face additional penalties. I almost laughed. The audacity was impressive in a way. They'd stolen my firewood and were now fining me for storing it improperly. I took photos of the notice and added it to my growing file of documentation. Thursday morning, I decided to take a different approach. I started knocking on doors. The first stop was Margaret Hartford's house. She answered in yoga pants and an oversized sweater, looking confused to see me. "Hi, Frank. What's up?" "Hi, Margaret. I wanted to talk to you about the firewood you took from my garage back in November. I've got it on camera and I'm sending invoices to everyone who helped themselves." Her face went pale. "Oh God, I'm so sorry. Rebecca told us it was a community thing. She said you'd agreed to share and that you had way more than you needed. She made it sound like you were being generous." "I never agreed to anything. Did she tell everyone the same story?" Margaret nodded vigorously. "Yes. She sent out an email through the HOA list. She said you donated it to help neighbors in need. I would never have just taken it otherwise. How much do I owe you?" I showed her my calculations. She'd taken approximately 3/4 of a cord over 2 trips, which came out to about $562. She pulled out her checkbook immediately and wrote me a check for $600. "I'm so embarrassed," she said, handing it over. "I'm adding a little extra for the trouble. I can't believe Rebecca lied like that. This is exactly the kind of thing she does. She steamrolls everyone and makes up rules as she goes along. Armed with this information, I continued my door-to-door visits. The Simmons family had a similar reaction, shocked and apologetic. They paid their share, around $450. The Petersons were out of town, but I left a note explaining the situation. By Friday afternoon, I'd collected about $2,000 from various neighbors, all of whom claimed Rebecca had told them I'd donated the wood. Every single person showed me the email she'd sent, dated November 3rd with the subject line, "Community Kindness, free firewood available." The email read, "Dear Meadowbrook Heights residents, Frank Fitzgerald at 428 Sage Drive has generously offered to share his excess firewood with neighbors in need this winter. He has approximately 4 cords available in his garage, free for community use. Please help yourselves, but be considerate of others. This is a wonderful example of the community spirit we strive to foster here at Meadowbrook Heights." I'd never seen this email because I wasn't on the HOA mailing list. When I'd bought the house, I'd specifically opted out of non-essential HOA communications, requesting only legally required notices. Rebecca knew this because we'd had a terse exchange about it at my first meeting when she'd criticized me for not responding to a request for volunteers. This was deliberate. She'd lied to the entire community, stolen my property, and then tried to fine me when I called her out on it. I sat in my home office that Friday evening, staring at the email forwards from my neighbors, and made a decision. This was going to court. Monday morning, I drove to a law office in downtown Boulder. I'd done my research over the weekend and found an attorney named James Kowalski who specialized in HOA disputes. His reviews suggested he didn't back down from fights, which was exactly what I needed. Kowalski was in his late 40s, with graying hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He listened to my story, reviewed my documentation, and actually whistled when he saw the email Rebecca had sent. "This is about as clear-cut as these cases get," he said. "She committed theft by deception and then attempted to retaliate when you objected. The email is damning evidence. She explicitly claimed you'd given permission when you hadn't. So what are my options? Several. We can file a civil suit for the full value of the wood plus damages. We can also file a criminal complaint for theft. Given the value, we're talking about a Class 2 misdemeanor in Colorado, potentially a Class 1 depending on how the DA wants to handle it, and we can go after the HOA itself for the retaliatory fine. How long will this take? Could be several months for the civil case. The criminal complaint would move faster once the DA picks it up, if they decide to prosecute. HOAs generally have insurance that covers this kind of thing, so they'll probably want to settle once they realize how bad this looks." "Let's file everything," I said. "I want this on record. Rebecca's been getting away with this kind of behavior for years, from what I hear. It's time someone pushed back." Kowalski grinned. "I was hoping you'd say that. I'll draw up the papers. Should have everything filed by end of week." I paid his retainer and left feeling like I'd finally taken control of the situation. But Rebecca wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. That Wednesday, I came home from a grocery run to find a notice posted on my door and one hammered into a stake in my front yard. The HOA was demanding I remove my unauthorized security cameras within 48 hours, claiming they violated the privacy rights of residents and visitors. The fine for non-compliance was listed as $1,000. I called Kowalski immediately. "Can they do this? Do you have cameras pointed at public streets or common areas, or just your own property?" "Just my property. One covers my front door and porch, One covers the garage and one covers my backyard. Then no, they absolutely cannot force you to remove them. Colorado law is very clear on this. You have every right to record your own property. This is more retaliation, and honestly, it's just digging them deeper. Don't remove anything. I'll add this to the complaint. The next few weeks were a masterclass in HOA petness. Rebecca and the board seemed determined to make my life miserable. I received violations for my trash cans being visible from the street for more than 12 hours after pickup, even though that had never been enforced before. I was cited for having a non-conforming mailbox decoration because Cooper had knocked against the post and loosened it slightly. They claimed my front yard needed reseeding because there were bare patches, despite it being February in Colorado and everyone's lawn looking dormant. Each violation came with a fine. Each fine went into my complaint file. Kowalski assured me this was actually helping our case. They're establishing a pattern of harassment, he explained during one of our phone calls. Every petty violation they throw at you just proves our retaliation claim. Let them keep going. It's like watching someone dig their own grave. The Petersons returned from their trip and paid me the $700 they owed. They were horrified by what Rebecca had done and mentioned they'd been considering selling because of how oppressive the HOA had become under her leadership. That conversation sparked an idea. I started attending HOA meetings again. The March meeting fell on a Thursday evening, held in the subdivision's community center, a small building near the entrance that mostly sat unused except for these monthly gatherings. About 30 people showed up, which was apparently higher than usual attendance. Rebecca ran the meeting with her typical iron fist, plowing through the agenda items without allowing much discussion. When it came time for homeowner comments, I raised my hand. She looked like she'd bitten into a lemon but had to acknowledge me per the bylaws. Yes, Frank, I stood up, keeping my voice level and calm. I want to address the community sharing initiative that was referenced earlier this winter. Several residents were told that I donated firewood for community use. I never made any such donation. The firewood was taken without my permission, based on false information, and I'm currently pursuing legal action to recover the value of my property. Murmuring broke out across the room. Rebecca's face flushed red. That's not appropriate discussion for an HOA meeting. This is a personal dispute. It's absolutely appropriate, I countered. The HOA president used her position to facilitate theft from a homeowner and then sent an official HOA email misrepresenting the situation. Residents deserve to know that. Todd Marshall, the treasurer, spoke up. He was a thin, nervous-looking man in his 60s who always seemed vaguely uncomfortable during meetings. Rebecca, did you actually send an email saying Frank had donated the firewood? I had reason to believe he was participating in community sharing, Rebecca said, her voice tight. There was a misunderstanding. What reason? Someone called from the back. It was Jim Chen, another homeowner I'd spoken with who'd refused to take any firewood specifically because he thought the whole situation seemed suspicious. I don't have to explain my reasoning to every busybody in this room, Rebecca snapped. The board operates on consensus, and we make decisions for the good of the community. Did the board vote on sending that email? Patricia Sullivan, the secretary, asked quietly. She was a mousy woman in her 50s who rarely spoke up. I don't remember voting on anything about firewood. It was an executive decision based on our community standards. That's not how this works, Todd said, looking through a binder of documents. Board decisions require votes. It's in the bylaws. The meeting devolved from there. Residents started asking questions about other decisions Rebecca had made. It turned out the community sharing initiative had never actually been voted on. Neither had several other policies she'd implemented. The more people talked, the more it became clear that Rebecca had been running the HOA like her personal fiefdom, making up rules and claiming board approval that didn't exist. By the end of the meeting, a motion had been made and passed to conduct an audit of all HOA decisions from the past 2 years. Rebecca tried to block it, but she was outvoted by Todd and Patricia, who seemed to have finally found their spines. A special meeting was scheduled for April to review the audit results and potentially vote on new board leadership. I left that meeting feeling vindicated but also slightly worried. Rebecca looked absolutely livid, and I had a feeling she wasn't going to take this lying down. I was right to be worried. The next morning, I woke up to find all 4 of my tires slashed. There were no cameras covering the street directly, and whoever had done it had been careful to stay out of view. I filed a police report, but without evidence, there wasn't much they could do. 2 days later, someone filed an anonymous complaint with the county about my illegal home business, claiming I was running a company out of my house in violation of residential zoning. I had to spend an afternoon dealing with a county inspector, showing my work from home setup and proving I wasn't actually operating a business in any meaningful sense beyond being remotely employed. The harassment escalated. My mail started going missing. Someone kept leaving dog waste on my front step, despite my yard being fenced and Cooper always being supervised. Anonymous complaints were filed with the city about noise, about parking violations, about everything imaginable. Through it all, Kowalski kept building the case. The civil suit was filed in Boulder County Court in late March, seeking damages of $6,000, the full value of my firewood plus labor, plus punitive damages for the harassment and retaliation. The criminal complaint was filed with the district attorney's office around the same time. The DA's office initially seemed disinterested. It was just firewood, and they had bigger cases to worry about. But Kowalski pushed, emphasizing the value and the deliberate deception involved. He provided the email as evidence and statements from neighbors confirming they'd been lied to. Finally, in early April, the DA agreed to pursue charges against Rebecca personally for theft by deception. The HOA's insurance company got involved at that point. I received a call from their attorney, a slick-sounding guy named Donald Pierce, who wanted to discuss settlement options before things went any further. My clients are prepared to offer $10,000 to resolve this matter completely, he said during our phone conference with Kowalski present. That covers your property loss and provides additional compensation for your inconvenience. In exchange, you drop all legal actions and sign a non-disclosure agreement. No, I said immediately. Mr. Fitzgerald, this is a generous offer. Litigation is expensive and time-consuming. There's no guarantee you'd win, and even if you did, you might not recover this much. I'm not signing an NDA. Rebecca needs to face consequences for what she's done, and the community needs to know about it. The money isn't really the point anymore, Pierce sighed. Let me consult with my clients and get back to you. The special HOA meeting happened on a Tuesday evening in mid-April. The community center was packed, over 60 residents showing up, which was apparently unprecedented. The audit results had been distributed beforehand, and they were damning. Rebecca had been making unilateral decisions for years. She'd approved contracts with vendors without board votes, including a landscaping company owned by her brother-in-law that was charging 50% more than market rate. She'd imposed fines inconsistently, waiving them for friends while aggressively pursuing them against people she didn't like. She'd used HOA funds to pay for personal expenses, including what appeared to be several spa visits that were categorized as board development expenses. The total misuse of funds appeared to exceed $20,000 over the past 3 years. And that was just what the auditor could definitively identify from the records. The actual amount was likely higher. Todd Marshall, looking like he'd aged 5 years in the past month, stood up to present the findings. His voice shook as he went through the report, but he didn't back down. When he finished, he turned to Rebecca. "Rebecca, the board is calling for your immediate resignation as president and removal from the board entirely. We'll be pursuing reimbursement of misappropriated funds through legal channels." Rebecca stood up, her face a mask of fury barely contained. "You ungrateful parasites. I've given 8 years to this community. 8 years of my time and effort, and this is how you repay me? Fine. I quit. Run this place into the ground for all I care. You'll be begging me to come back within 6 months. She grabbed her purse and stormed out. The room sat in stunned silence for a moment before someone started clapping. It spread until most of the room was applauding. Patricia Sullivan was actually crying, whether from relief or stress or both, but Rebecca's drama wasn't over. 2 weeks later, she countersued me for defamation and emotional distress, claiming I'd orchestrated a campaign to destroy her reputation. It was a slap suit, a strategic lawsuit against public participation, designed to intimidate me into backing down. Her attorney was probably betting I'd fold rather than face the expense of defending myself. Kowalski just laughed when he saw the filing. "This is perfect. Colorado has strong anti-slap laws. We'll get this dismissed and probably get awarded attorney fees." "She's just making everything worse for herself." He was right. The judge dismissed her suit within 30 days, calling it frivolous and retaliatory, and ordering Rebecca to pay $15,000 in attorney fees to me. She filed an appeal, which was also quickly dismissed. Meanwhile, the criminal case moved forward. The DA assigned it to a young prosecutor named Sarah Chen, who seemed genuinely offended by what Rebecca had done. She called me in for an interview in early May, taking my statement and reviewing all the evidence again. "The thing that really gets me," Sarah said, "is the entitlement. She genuinely seemed to believe she could just take your property and face no consequences. And then, when you objected, she tried to punish you for it. That's textbook abuse of power." "Will it actually go to trial?" I asked. "Depends on whether she takes a plea deal. The evidence is solid. If she's smart, she'll plead guilty to a reduced charge and accept probation with restitution. If she wants to fight it, we'll take it to trial. Either way, she's facing consequences." Rebecca, it turned out, was not smart. She rejected the plea deal, convinced she could beat the charges. Her attorney tried to argue that there was no theft because the firewood had been in an unlocked garage, implying implied permission. The judge wasn't buying it. The trial was scheduled for late June. I had to testify, walking through the timeline of events and explaining the evidence. The prosecutor displayed the security camera footage on screens in the courtroom, showing Rebecca and others loading up my firewood over multiple trips. They showed the email she'd sent lying about my permission. They brought in neighbors who testified that they'd been deceived into thinking I'd agreed to donate the wood. Rebecca's attorney tried to paint me as a vindictive neighbor pursuing a grudge, but it fell flat. The evidence was too clear. After 2 days of trial, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before coming back with a guilty verdict on all counts. The sentencing hearing happened 2 weeks later. Rebecca stood before the judge, still looking defiant even as her attorney pleaded for leniency. The judge wasn't having it. "Mrs. Emerson, You abused a position of trust within your community. You deliberately deceived your neighbors, stole property, and then engaged in a campaign of retaliation when you were caught. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. This was sustained, calculated misconduct over months. The judge sentenced her to 90 days in county jail, suspended pending completion of 1 year of probation, and ordered her to pay full restitution of $6,000 to me, plus community service. She was also banned from serving in any HOA leadership position during her probation. Rebecca's face crumpled when the sentence was read. For the first time through this whole ordeal, she seemed to realize she wasn't going to bully or argue her way out of this. Her husband, a quiet man named Richard who'd barely been visible throughout the proceedings, put his arm around her shoulders as she cried. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness watching it. I'd won, but it had taken so much time and energy to get to this point. Part of me wondered if it had been worth it. The civil case settled shortly after the criminal conviction. The HOA's insurance paid out $12,000, covering my actual damages plus compensation for the harassment and my legal fees. Kowalski took his cut, and I walked away with enough to replace my firewood supply 3 times over. But the real victory was what happened to the HOA itself. Patricia Sullivan became the interim president, and she immediately started implementing reforms. Board meetings became actually transparent, with detailed minutes posted online. Financial records were made available to all homeowners. A formal complaint process was established with clear procedures and accountability. Several of Rebecca's other improper decisions were reversed. The landscaping contract with her brother-in-law was terminated, saving the HOA thousands per year. Arbitrary fines were refunded. The subdivision actually started feeling like a community instead of a dictatorship. I ran into Margaret Hartford at the grocery store in late July, a few weeks after everything had finally resolved. She smiled when she saw me and came over to chat. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "for standing up to Rebecca. A lot of us were too scared or too tired to fight back. You did what needed to be done." "I was just protecting my property," I said, feeling slightly embarrassed. "It was more than that. You showed everyone that the board isn't untouchable, that there are consequences for abusing power. The HOA has been so much better since Patricia took over. We're actually planning community events people want to attend. It feels like a neighborhood now." That conversation stuck with me. I hadn't set out to reform the HOA or become some kind of community hero. I just wanted my firewood back and for Rebecca to face consequences for stealing it. But the ripple effects had been significant. The Petersons decided not to sell after all. The Simmons family, who'd been looking at moving, stayed as well. Property values in the subdivision actually increased slightly over the summer as word got out that the HOA had cleaned up its act. People wanted to live in a community with functional, transparent governance. I bought 6 cords of firewood that fall, learning from experience. I also built a proper locked shed in my backyard to store it, with cameras covering every angle. Cooper helped supervise the construction, mostly by lying in the shade and occasionally investigating interesting smells. The first cold snap came in October, and I enjoyed the satisfaction of building a fire in my fireplace with wood I'd paid for and secured properly. The flames crackled and popped, throwing dancing shadows across the walls. Cooper curled up on his bed nearby, content in the warmth. There was a knock on my door around 7 that evening. I opened it to find Patricia Sullivan standing there with a plate of cookies. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," she said. "I wanted to bring these by and say thank you officially. The board is doing a thank you for everyone who helped with the transition, but I wanted to personally acknowledge what you did." You really didn't have to do that, I said, accepting the cookies. They smelled amazing, like cinnamon and butter. I did, though. I was on the board with Rebecca for 3 years, and I was too intimidated to stand up to her. I watched her bully people and bend rules, and I told myself it wasn't my responsibility to intervene. Your situation was the wake-up call I needed. Sometimes it takes someone from outside the system to show you how broken it is. We talked for a while, and she filled me in on the HOA's plans. They were working on revising the entire covenant to make it more reasonable and clear. They were bringing in a professional management company to handle day-to-day operations and ensure proper oversight. They were even planning a community barbecue for Labor Day weekend to try to rebuild neighborhood connections. You should come, Patricia said as she was leaving. It would mean a lot to people. I did attend the barbecue, bringing Cooper along since it was dog-friendly. It was surprisingly pleasant. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to came up to introduce themselves and chat. Jim Chen brought his kids, who immediately wanted to play with Cooper. The Simmons family manned the grill, cooking burgers and hot dogs for anyone who wanted them. Margaret Hartford cornered me near the drinks cooler. "So, did you hear the latest?" "What's that?" "Rebecca and Richard are selling their house. They're moving to Arizona. She apparently can't handle living here anymore after everything that happened." I felt a twinge of something. Not quite guilt, but perhaps acknowledgement that my actions had permanently altered someone's life. Then again, she'd brought it on herself through her own choices. "How do you feel about that?" Margaret asked, watching my face. Honestly, relieved. I wasn't looking forward to awkward encounters at the grocery store for the next 20 years. She laughed. "Fair enough. I think most people feel the same way, though her husband is apparently a nice guy. I feel bad for him having to uproot." The summer faded into fall and fall into winter. My new firewood supply stayed exactly where I left it, unmolested in its locked shed. The HOA operated smoothly under Patricia's leadership, handling the usual business of maintaining common areas and organizing community events without drama or controversy. I settled into a comfortable routine. Work went well. Cooper and I took long hikes in the nearby forest preserves on weekends. I even started dating someone I'd met at a coffee shop downtown. A veterinary technician named Sarah who thought my HOA saga was simultaneously hilarious and horrifying. The criminal justice system continued grinding along in the background. Rebecca completed her probation without incident, doing her community service at a local food bank and apparently keeping her head down. The HOA recovered most of the misappropriated funds through a civil suit against her, though it took nearly a year to work through the courts. The following spring, almost exactly a year after the special meeting that ended Rebecca's reign, the HOA held elections for board positions. Patricia chose not to run for president, saying she'd only stepped in to help with the transition and wasn't interested in long-term leadership. Todd Marshall ran and won, along with a slate of new board members who seemed genuinely interested in serving the community rather than controlling it. I was standing in my yard one Saturday in April, cleaning up winter debris and getting ready to plant some flowers, when a moving truck pulled up to Rebecca's old house. A young couple got out, looking excited and slightly overwhelmed. They had 2 small kids who immediately started exploring the yard. Cooper barked from inside, wanting to investigate the new neighbors. I walked over to introduce myself, bringing him along on his leash. "Hi, I'm Frank. I live just down the street. Welcome to the neighborhood." The husband, a friendly guy in his 30s, shook my hand enthusiastically. "Thanks. I'm David, this is my wife Amy, and those are our kids, Mason and Emma. We're excited to be here. Everyone we've talked to has been so welcoming." The HOA is pretty reasonable, I said. If you have any questions about how things work, feel free to ask. And welcome to Meadowbrook Heights. Amy smiled. That's great to hear. We were worried about the HOA situation, actually. The previous owners mentioned there had been some drama, but they said it had all been resolved. It has, I confirmed. Things are good now. We chatted for a few more minutes before I left them to their unpacking. Walking back to my house with Cooper trotting beside me, I reflected on how much had changed in 2 years. When I'd first moved here, I just wanted a quiet place to live and work. Instead, I'd ended up in the middle of an HOA battle that went all the way to criminal court. But looking around the subdivision now, seeing neighbors actually talking to each other and kids playing in yards and the community spaces being used for their intended purposes, I felt like it had been worth it. Sometimes standing up for yourself ended up benefiting everyone around you in ways you couldn't predict. That evening, I built a fire in my fireplace using wood from my secure shed. Cooper settled in his usual spot, and I opened my laptop to catch up on some work. The house was warm and comfortable, the flames providing both heat and ambience. Outside, the spring evening was cool but pleasant, with birds singing their twilight songs. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, asking if I wanted to grab dinner tomorrow night. I smiled and typed back a confirmation. Life was good. The firewood was secured, the HOA was functioning properly, and I'd learned some valuable lessons about standing up for yourself and your property rights. The whole ordeal had started with stolen firewood and ended with criminal charges, civil suits, HOA reform, and a complete shift in how the subdivision operated. It had taken months of stress, legal fees, and confrontation to get to this point. But sitting in my warm house with my dog beside me and plans for tomorrow night, I could honestly say I'd do it all again if I had to. Sometimes the principle mattered more than the convenience. Sometimes you had to fight back against people who thought their position gave them the right to take what wasn't theirs. And sometimes, when you stood up for yourself, you ended up making things better for everyone else too. The fire crackled and popped, consuming the wood I'd legitimately purchased and properly secured. Outside, Meadowbrook Heights settled into a peaceful evening, a community that had learned some hard lessons about accountability and governance. And I settled into my evening too, content with how things had turned out and ready for whatever came next. Rebecca, Emerson had tried to steal my firewood and punish me for objecting. Instead, she'd lost everything she'd built over 8 years, faced criminal charges, and been driven out of the community she'd once ruled. The other board members who'd enabled her had been replaced with people who actually wanted to serve rather than control, and me. I'd gotten my money back, reformed an HOA, and learned that sometimes the biggest battles start with the smallest things, like firewood. 4 cords of oak that someone thought they could take without consequences, and the long chain of events that followed when one person decided those consequences mattered. Cooper shifted in his sleep, making the little huffing sound he did when he was dreaming. I reached down to scratch his ears, and he settled again. The fire burned steady and warm, my legitimately acquired firewood serving its intended purpose. Outside my window, the lights of my neighbors' houses glowed in the gathering darkness, a community at peace after its storm. That was really all I'd wanted in the first place. Peace, warmth, and the simple assurance that what was mine would stay mine unless I chose otherwise. It had taken a year of legal battles and community upheaval to secure those basic things, but in the end, justice had prevailed. Rebecca had faced consequences, the HOA had reformed, and I had my firewood, properly secured and undisturbed. The story could have ended so many different ways. I could have let it go, written off the loss and moved on. Many people would have. But something in me had refused to accept that Rebecca could just take what she wanted and face no accountability. That refusal to accept injustice had driven everything that followed. As I sat there that evening, warm fire burning and my dog sleeping peacefully nearby, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Not just because I'd won, but because I'd stood up for what was right even when it was difficult and expensive and time-consuming. The money I'd recovered didn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. What mattered was that someone who'd abused their power for years had finally faced consequences, and a community had been freed from her control. Sometimes justice takes time. Sometimes it takes effort and resources, and a willingness to stand firm even when people tell you to let it go. But when it finally arrives, when the scales finally balance out and things are set right, it feels worth every moment of struggle that led there. My firewood burned bright and warm that evening, legitimate fuel purchased and secured through proper means, heating my home exactly as intended. And that simple fact, that basic restoration of order and justice, felt like the truest victory of all.